inflation landscape is Professor John Gachi. Professor John Gachi is the Dean of the School of Business, or the Business School at the University of Cape Coast, UCC, which is in Cape Coast. And we also have with us Professor Charles Aka, who is a Senior Research Fellow at ISE at the University of Ghana. And we also have Dr. Priscilla Chumesi Bafo, who is a Senior Lecturer at the Department of Economics. These are the people who are well vested to deal with the matter. I do not. I would only moderate tonight. But Norvan Reports, if you don't know about us, we are a data-driven, media agency, and our main aim is to make sure that we get the news to you on time, accurate news, making sure that it's in-depth, and making sure that whatever we serve you is done using the most independent analysis point of view, where we are not coerced or pushed by anybody. We use data a lot in what we do, and we ensure that our news is one that is objective as well. And we're doing this tonight with the Economics Governance Platform. And as I did indicate to you, I must remind those of you who have just joined us that, look, in recent years, we all do know that Ghana has faced fluctuating levels of inflation, and that has significant implications for businesses, for you as a citizen, and the economy at large. It is for this reason that we have assembled the panel to bring, to help us delve into the multifaceted aspects of Ghana's inflation, exploring its underlying causes, economic impacts, and the potential strategies to help us mitigate, the inflation that we are feeling all around us, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, we would look at the dynamics of understanding inflation. We would also try to look at the economic impact and the social consequence of it. We will try our best to also look at inflation and its rippling effect on businesses. The government policies and responses to the inflation is the one that has been good for us. And tonight, our panel will also help us, to look at the international and regional context of inflation as well. It's important. We don't live in isolation. So that's the reason why we'll try to understand these things. And then we'll look at strategies for inflation mitigation. And that's what we'll be looking at. Thank you very much, all of you. Dr. Priscilla Chumesi, we have sent you a request so you can be a speaker. But let's start with Professor Charles Aka. Maybe we can have him unmute himself. For him, this is the first time he's come on the space. So we want to start with him, fresh voice, to help us understand Ghana's inflation landscape. I mean, where we are today, how is it that it become very difficult? If you look at it, how can we navigate? How is it that it's become very difficult for us to deal with it? What are the dynamics of inflation at the moment? How can he explain to we, the ordinary, Ghanaians, to understand the dynamics of Ghana's inflation as it is? Professor Charles Aka, if you can unmute yourself, please.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, sir.
Okay, good evening, Norvan, and good evening to all your listeners. In terms of my understanding of Ghana's inflation, our inflation, well, if you have data and you look back to the 1960s, you will see that our inflation has not really changed. Over the last 6.5 decades, we've had a persistent high inflation, sometimes volatile, but most of our history has been double digit. In a few years, we have recorded single digit, but that's not been sustainable. And in some difficult times, we've gone past 30-40%. Last year, we recorded about 54% inflation. And even as I'm talking, I think we are still above 43%. So what are the dynamics? And I think there's several factors that are persistent across the regions and over time. The main culprit of inflation in Ghana is a failure of agriculture. And because our inflation is mainly food inflation, as we are currently observing, you will see food inflation is what is driving the whole inflation. Food inflation is around 50, 64%, 67% sometime last year, when non-food inflation is around 33%, for example. So twice as much of inflation is in the food sector. And why is food sector a problem? So it's mainly because of lack of investment in food production. Food security is a challenge in Ghana, and there's no economy that develops without having food sovereignty and energy sovereignty. And we have failed on both sides. So food is driving the inflation. And why is it that? One of the reasons is that productivity in the agriculture sector is quite low. There's been little investment in agriculture sector in food production. So we depend a lot on imported food, name it oil, name rice, sugar, and all the things. So if you look at the disaggregated inflation figures, you will see that most of the for the food, for example, you will see the driver is something like fruit and vegetable juices, 66.7% inflation. Okay, that's the July inflation. Okay, you will see things like cereals and cereal products, 64.2%. You will see animal meat, poultry, 55.2%, fish, seafood, 57.7%, milk and dairy product, eggs, 58%, oil and fat, 59.5%, sugar, confectionery, 64.6%, and the like. In fact, tea, the highest is actually tea. Tea and other plant products for infusion. This is 150% inflation. That's what you see. Cocoa drinks, we produce cocoa in Ghana, and yet cocoa drinks inflation, the change over the 1 year between July 2022 and July 2023 is 86.5%. Cocoa drinks, water, even basic thing like water, is 52.3%. Soft drinks, 44.7%. So you see that the food items I've listed, they are all around about 50, 60 plus percent. And that tells you that we have a big problem in gaining food sovereignty, basic food for people to eat. The price is going up every year by such magnitude. So that's actually taking away people's purchasing power. Even if you cannot rent and you cannot go on holiday, you expect people to be able to eat basic food and like cereals, and yet the prices are high because productivity is low. We don't produce much. We are relying on the natural weather. So there's little irrigation. There's little science and development going on to produce varieties of seeds and other varieties that can withstand harsh weather and drought. So food production is actually abysmal, and therefore most of these foods I've listed, they're imported. We import almost all of this poultry. Okay, we import fish. We import oil. We import milk. We even importing vegetables. We're importing fruit juices here and there. And when you not depend on import, then there's a problem. The cost is high, and also the cost is influenced by inflation and exchange rate depreciation. So when the thing is imported in dollars, and then you pay the freight and you pay the duties, and then you get here, and then your city depreciates, the price of these things all go up. So that is one of the greatest drivers of inflation, food. But when you come to non-food, then you also see that even for the non-food sector, it's also driven by alcoholic beverages. Okay, so these are also imported alcoholic beverages. Most of the alcohol that people are drinking is also imported. 50, that's about 48.7%. It will be followed by things like furnishings, household equipment, iron, rice cooker, all those kind of things, mobile phone, and those kind of things are all imported. 56.9%. Personal care, social protection, all this in 60%. And then even when you come to things like transport, it's also almost 30%. Health, 41%. Housing, water, electricity, gas, 47.4%. Gas to cook, rent, these things, water production, they are all about 40%. So even the non-food inflation is also quite driven by imported things and lack of control. So these are the two issues to look at inflation. We may talk about policy failure later on, what should policy do, but maybe as my introductory remark, until we solve our food and energy and import dependence problem, we will not really handle the issue of inflation in Ghana.
Very well. Thank you very much, Prof. If I got it right, I think that the major issue to high inflation, as you say, has to do with agriculture and the food inflation, which is spiraling up. Am I right?
Yes, you are right.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. We'll come back to you. Let's now go to Professor John Gachi. So I reserve Professor Letumesi for last. So, Prof, so your colleague, Professor Charles Aka from ISA, says that our biggest problem today in Ghana and what is spurring inflation to go high has to do with agriculture. And that is what is happening at the moment. I don't know what your thoughts are. In your opening or preliminary remarks, what you say is the dynamics or what is causing the level of inflation that we see today in this country.
Thank you very much. Well, I 100% agree with him. It's like over time we have over-liberalized our economy and move away from agriculture in terms of investment and in terms of participation. And as a result of that, basic commodities we cannot produce. I believe you are well aware that we spend about $400 or $600 million to import tomatoes into this country. And when we were growing up, we know the areas where tomatoes is grown and in commercial quantities. We can mention a place like Akumadan and the rest. But all those places have been left away. There is no galvanized policy to actually incentivize people into the production of various items on the food list that we need as a country. So as a result, we have to import them, and the import has impact on the pricing of for these items. So agriculture is the main problem. Then again, if you look at agriculture, what we have not been able to invest in is what we call cold chain, or what we call preservation tools like silos, etc., warehouse system. And in fact, if you talk to commodities exchange, one of the problems they are facing is investment infrastructure that will be able to keep food items over a long period. Then we have not introduced technology, basic technology that can be applied to certain food items that can last over a long period of time. So as a result of that, we are only doing seasonal. And after that season, then we go into difficulties about pricing of these items. So I do agree that agriculture is the main problem. So our backsliding from agriculture will have to be reversed, and then we stop paying lip service. Then we also have to integrate into agriculture properly processing. So when my colleague was mentioning the figures, you see fruit juice, etc. We used to import fruit juice from South Africa, and then I believe the MENA countries, that's the Middle East countries, to the country. And the question is, can't we process fruit into fruit juices in this country? So we have not paid attention to some of these things. So I believe if we are able to pay attention to these things, we will be able to solve the problem halfway. In fact, inflation over time have been undulating. Of course, as I said, the greater part have been high inflation. In fact, in 1999, for example, September, our inflation is so low, and we thought we could do so many things. And within a short period of time, inflation was hitting 50. And all those things that we planned to do as a country, we could not do any of them because inflation could not allow us to do that. Uh, Even times where we are able to see lower inflation eating into single digit inflation is because it is artificial. Take, for example, before we started experiencing this hit on inflation, we have to revise the base period for the CPI. And when you do that, automatically, statistically, you are going to be recording lower inflation. Not necessarily because you have done something so significant. So even times of lower inflation, we don't see it reflecting because it's just a statistical adjustment that we have done. So I believe if we are able to focus on agriculture, allow investment in agriculture, allow infusion of basic technology into agriculture and simple processing, we will be able to go a long way. And we also need to appreciate the fact that there is a fine relationship between the indicators of price stability. For example, inflation and interest rate and exchange rate. That's a fine relationship with it. So if there's a distortion in one, that will have influence on the other. And that is the cycle that we have been going through all these years.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. I'm sure that one of the biggest points you made, if I'm correct, is government must begin to stop paying lip service to agriculture. And then also we must begin to think of ways to process our agricultural produce, especially when it comes to the fruits, the tomatoes, because we know Palugu factory and all those factories that used to exist in this country, we don't seem to have, taking hold of it. We are left with very few factories that are trying to produce, but they don't have the strength to, produce for the whole country and think of even, exporting what we have. After it's here with us, and it just looks like we have a lot of work to do. All right, I'm sure I'm right, Prof?
Yeah, you are right.
Okay, thank you very much. So we will quickly, ladies and gentlemen, if you just joined us, this is the Norvan Report Economics Governance Platform Twitter Spaces tonight. Our topic is navigating Ghana's inflation landscape, challenges, impact, and strategies that we need to put in place to be able to deal with the situation. And our guest for tonight is Professor John Gachi, who is the Dean of the Business School at the University of Cape Coast. We also have Professor Charles Aka, who is a Senior Research Fellow at ISE. He was our first speaker, and then after him, we just also listened to Professor John Gachi. So we are moving to Dr. Priscilla Chumesi Bafo. And just to remind you, if you have any question or you have a contribution, for now you can tweet at Norvan Reports. Tweet at us at Norvan Reports. Or what we do is that at some point we'll give room for you to be able to ask your questions or also bring your contributions. But we'll encourage you to retweet, tweet the link, share it on your Twitter, on your WhatsApp pages, on your Facebook pages. Invite someone to be part of this discussion tonight. My name is Norvan Reports. I'm from Norvan Reports. I'm here with my team, and we are moderating tonight's Twitter space. So let me come to you, Doc. Dr. Priscilla Chumesi Bafo. I don't know what your initial thoughts also is, looking at the dynamics of inflation in this country. If you can share with us, please, if you can unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Norvan, and good evening to your participants and my fellow panelists. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Please go ahead.
Awesome. So essentially, I believe that I support exactly the points that have been raised by my fellow panelists. Agriculture and the whole value chain, it's not working as expected to support essentially manufacturing in the country. And that explains to a large extent the challenge we have. But yes, Ghana has historically struggled with inflation. We know that around the time of structural adjustments, inflation was about 123 thereabout. So consistently, we have had very high inflation levels. But I also want to situate the discussion for us to not to forget that up until from April 2018 till about March 2020, essentially the data indicates that we had sort of got a hang on inflation in the sense that the country persistently recorded single-digit inflation. The challenge really is that when you look at the data, the incidence of COVID is a strong indicator in there. And so in that sense, you see that globally prices were elevated, and essentially because of the nature of it and the fact that developed countries had paid people even when they were home. So there were significant supply side challenges and people had a lot of money to spend. So you see that in the developed world, their central banks have had to be very tight on monetary policy to control inflation. And Ghana is not an isolated incident. So I believe that in that context, yes, globally, countries have struggled. In addition to the war in Eastern Europe, which has also led to significant supply shocks in the area of cereals and in the area of energy as well. So when you look at the situation, inflation situation in Ghana, essentially, like Professor Aka indicated, food prices is very strong in there. You see also movements in fuel prices that influences transportation. Exchange rate depreciation is a big deal as well. Because our economy is highly import dependent. So the slightest movements in the depreciation of the cedi translates directly into cost of imports. So you see that here we have two things. Prices have risen abroad, so we are importing inflation domestically. In addition to the fact that the currency we are using has also depreciated, so it translates directly, and it is in no doubt that we are seeing the high rate of inflation which the country is struggling to control. So at the national level, essentially, we need to tackle food production. It is critical. In addition to tackling issues with challenges on the supply side, and also finding ways to sort of reduce our level of dependence on imports. Why am I saying this? I said we have a lot of firms in this country who, quote unquote, are producing stuff, but they are basically importing things and adding very small value and selling. So when that happens, you see that the slightest movement in the currency or prices abroad is directly imported, and that feeds into it. And when inflation occurs, principally, who are the people that struggle? People on fixed income. So salaried workers are at the mercy of it. It robs people of their hard-earned incomes. And so to the extent that we know that a lot of people also depend on fixed income in the formal sector and even in the formal sector, informal sector, the fact that people are doing very menial jobs is an indicator that inflation has a significant toll and a negative impact on people. So on the credit side, it increases cost of loans, especially when people are on varied loans that are pegged to movement in inflation is an indicator. It also results in people, dollarization of the economy. People will quote prices in dollars because the cost of changing prices every time is too high. And so in that sense, negative returns on investments. And we have seen that given that interest rates have risen in the developed world, people will repatriate their profits and people will move their investments abroad. Because now when you look at the rate of interest on T-bills, for example, and the inflation rates, you see that the net return on investment is negative, and resources would move where incentives are. So essentially, you find that kind of thing, and then depreciation continues. So, how do we tackle this? We see that government uses fiscal policy. Central bank will use monetary policy to tackle this. So, on the monetary side, the expectation would be that there is the need to tighten the monetary environment through persistent increase in interest rate, prime rate to, so quote and unquote, reduce the level of liquidity in the system. But here you find that you see persistent arguments with regards to whether the inflation is really because of too much money. But the point is that if demand and supply are moving and you don't do anything, it would have a very dire impact. So to some extent, the prime rate increases controls the inflation a bit. But for us, our eyes should really be on the supply side factors. What are the limiting factors that is not making our agricultural sector productive, our firms productive to be able to produce and feed ourselves, and probably look at alternatives in export? And so essentially, the challenge is that to be able to have a good hang on the inflation rates, monetary policy is doing its side, but it needs to be supported with contractionary fiscal policy. That is, government needs to tighten its belt as well with regards to reducing expenditure, because if the prices are rising because of high demand and then supply is not able to meet it, then we need to curtail that demand. And government is has a huge stake in this scenario. So when you look at the mid-year budget review, you find that there is some attempt to reduce the level of expenditure on the fiscal side. And that you can see has led to the revision of the growth rate from, I think, 2.8% to about 1.5% for 2023. So essentially, inflation takes its toll on the economy. It takes its toll on individuals, particularly with people who are on fixed incomes, like salaried workers like you and me. And that means that people ought to adopt strategies. I believe that as the conversation goes on, we will go into that bit. So that would be my initial submission.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Priscilla Chumesi. And since you actually went into the area of monetary policy, where you made a statement by saying that monetary policy is doing its work and we must see the physical side also do that. Let me quickly just acknowledge all our listeners who have joined us on the space. We thank you very much. And if you just joined us, this is the Norvan Report Economic Governance Platform Twitter space. The topic is navigating Ghana's inflation landscape challenges, impact, and strategies. And we're looking at how it impacts on you, on business, and on the economy. So that's why it's important for you to be part of this space. Now, Doc, there's a question that came in, and the question was, it says, has the BOG's inflation targeting approach over the years worked? And is Ghana's economy responsive to that approach at all? And I know that this question has come up several times at MPC meetings. From where you sit, do you think, or would you say, that the approach by the central bank of single-digit inflation targeting has worked, or is it working?
Okay, thank you, Norvan. I believe that the issue of single-digit inflation is very topical, and the discussion has been, as a country, do we need a single-digit inflation to say that we are there? The evidence would be that we need to do rigorous research to come out with the ideal level of inflation that would work for the country. But essentially, as we talk about inflation, we also know as economists that some level of inflation is good for the economy because it's sort of more like the oil that oils the engine of productive activity in the sense that it creates incentives here and there. But if you ask me whether inflation targeting has worked, then the question I would ask is, what were the indicators when we were doing what do we call it, targeting aggregates in terms of money supply and specific variables within the monetary framework when we were not doing inflation targeting? And from where I sit, the data does not support it, that inflation targeting is not working.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me take the same question to Professor Charles Akka. Prof, I mean, the question has come up with the area of whether, BOG's inflation targeting approach has worked over the years, and is Ghana's economy responsive to that? And this is based on, if you look at the July 2023 year-on-year inflation that was released, you will get to know that if you look at note 11 out of Ghana's 16 regions have inflation rate above the national average. And interestingly, Northeast, one of the poorest regions in the country, currently has the highest level of inflation of 62.2. How are the poorest of the poor coping with these levels of inflation? This is a question coming from Louise Hardy.
Norvan, thank you. Please, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can hear you, please.
Okay, thank you. So the problem is not inflation targeting. I think inflation targeting itself is not the issue. The central bank needs to get some band within which they can make monetary policy. So there's a target of 8 plus or minus 2%. For me, is not the issue. The issue is is for us to properly diagnose at every point in time t, what are the causes of inflation. There are several factors that cause inflation, and economic theory has divided them into two basic factors. There's a demand pull inflation, and if inflation is being caused by excess demand, i.e., excess demand chasing fewer goods, that's the monetarist approach. The monetarist seems to think that inflation is everywhere, a monetary phenomena. Okay, this is defunct economics. We've gone past that. We know that inflation is not always money. Those who believe in monetarism, including many central banks, they believe that anytime you see inflation, then it means that money supply is the problem. And therefore, you need to try to rein in money supply, slow it down. Then the main weapon they have is to increase the policy rate, okay, or to use other quantitative measures to try to slow down money. But we know that inflation is not everywhere monetary phenomena. There are other causes of inflation, and the particular inflation that we are facing over the last year and year and a half is a supply shock. So which means that in the 70s, 80s, where there was oil price shock, for example, supply shock, because there's war going on somewhere, as we are having in Ukraine, then that is not a monetary phenomena. It's not money supply that is the culprit. Okay, then you need other tools, not demand side policies. You need supply side policies, especially fiscal policy, to deal with it. And I think you rightly raised the question. If the inflation in Ghana, and it's not, because the World Bank has released a new report a few weeks ago that shows that inflation in Ghana is not a monetary issue. What is causing the inflation to see 60-something% in Northeast is not because people in Northeast have a lot of money and they are trying to buy goods or food and then that is chasing. No, it's not. And I don't like sometimes to hear that it's because the Bank of Ghana has printed money and is, monetary finance that is causing the inflation. The evidence doesn't show that. Rather, what we are facing is because, as I tell you, inflation is mainly food, and we don't have enough food produced and stored and processed in this country. So it's food shortage. If fertilizer is not available because of Ukraine war, or you are not getting cereals from Ukraine, or you're importing poultry, and then your exchange rate has fallen, and then the price of poultry has gone up, I don't see how raising the policy rate is the most sound thing to do. It will not be. So that is where I think we are having a problem. And I think for me, the central bank raising the policy rate is not mainly to fight inflation. And it has not really worked, even with a lag of almost 1 year. It's not really working. If it was working, we would have seen that inflation would have come down, because see, they have raised the policy rate from 14.5% to about 30%. This is phenomenal, almost unprecedented. And here we are still having inflation around 43%, because there are other factors that are at play, and those factors have not been handled. Policy on the fiscal side is gone to sleep. So what should we have done as other countries have done in the past? When you see that inflation is not a monetary phenomenon, is not the money supply. If you take the data from Bank of Ghana itself, and I want everybody to check, take M1, M2, M2 plus, all the monetary aggregates, plot them, just look at a correlation between the CPI inflation and all the money supply. You cannot discern any positive relationship. I've done that for years. You can't see it. If you run it in a regression, you cannot find a significant positive relationship that shows that as money supply goes up in Ghana, inflation is going up. It doesn't work. So at least for Ghana, in our context, the driver of inflation is not money supply, in my opinion. And that is where we need to now look at how do we address the issue. Look at fuel. If fuel, imported fuel, look at what is happening at our fuel pump. Almost every week, every 2 weeks, fuel price has gone up from about 5 cedis per liter. Now we are talking about 13 cedis per liter. How is that money a money matter? It's because we are not producing fuel here. We are not processing it. We are importing it. Now we say go for oil, and the price is high. If you keep increasing the policy rate, I don't see how that address the issue at the pump. So I think we need to now look at the comprehensive policy tools that we have to address the kind of inflation that we have. In other countries, fiscal policy has come into support. Government, they have used price control in other countries. They have used, support to households. They've sent $1,000. They've sent some money to households to be able to alleviate the cost of living crisis that they are facing. We are not doing that here. And then we keep on increasing and making the cost of borrowing even high for households and for businesses. I think we are wrong. And I started saying this over a year ago, that as far as I'm concerned, the monetary policy is not going to be the one to address the inflation. It could help. Of course, they cannot sit down doing nothing because the fiscal side was not working. And if you look at the central bank governance report, the annual report of the Bank of Ghana, they said that the fiscal policy was idle. Over the last 1 year, since they read the budget, the Minister of Finance sat down almost doing nothing. Minister of Finance, Minister of Agriculture, when prices were going up the roof. So the central bank, the only tools they have is basically the monetary policy rate. And they were actually trying to protect the cedi. I think the argument from the central bank, in my view, should be that they increase the policy rate mainly to maintain external balance, because there was pressure on the cedi. The U.S. Federal Reserve was raising their interest rate, and for us not to have capital reversal so that people would draw their investment and take their capital to the U.S., we needed to close the gap between our interest rate and the U.S. interest rate. So if you increase the interest rate, it tries to stabilize your cedi to some extent, but it doesn't really fight this kind of inflation that we are having.
Thank you very much, Prof. Let me go to Professor Gachi. Coming to I want us to look at, the rippling effects of inflation on the businessman and then also its effects, because there are some businessmen on the call today and they want to understand. I'm sure that some have said that it makes planning very, very difficult, because if you explore the challenges faced by businesses due to rising costs and uncertainty pricing, it's important that we examine the role of inflation in shaping business decisions, including hiring and expansion plans as well. How does inflation affect these people? Because you teach in the business school. You're not just an economist, but you teach in the business school, Professor Gachi. How is this, making it very difficult, even for employment?
Yeah, I think you have said it all. Even though in Ghana we do not have an announced optimum level of inflation, we need to have a band within which we work with. By doing so, you are able to give space to businesses to plan for everything. But as it is, they find it difficult to plan because things are changing often, prices are changing often, and that makes it very difficult to plan. Interest rate is changing frequently, prices of goods are changing frequently, so that actually makes it very difficult for businesses to plan and to execute. And when we are discussing inflation, we have to appreciate the fact that it actually put pressure on cost structure of businesses. So the cost structure goes up. What they are able to do today, they are not able to do the same thing tomorrow. And you cannot continue to increase prices. You will get to a point of saturation. When you are further increasing prices, that creates problem for your goods, and that creates problem for your product. So that creates an environment of difficulty for businesses. Of course, managing labor for businesses will become problematic as you keep inflation very high. And again, when you come to the general economy, there is something we call Abraham Maslow theory. If you look at that theory, you will realize that the majority of the people are actually looking for shelter, food, those basic things. But you will realize that those basic necessities of life have become very expensive, and you will see a lot of them moving from the already existing poverty level to endemic poverty level across the country. I think Statistical Service has already indicated to us about 850,000 Ghanaians have moved into the poverty line. So these are some of the difficulties that you see from cost structure effect on businesses and from the general population.
So, okay, Prof. So let me ask you this: how should businesses be able to look at their, if I would say, deal with inflation that would help them to be able to do the manage inflationary pressures on, as you say, their costs? So what should be the strategies that should be adopted by companies? Because as we sit in this country, we know that unemployment is so high. If costs is expensive for businesses, they might be looking at cutting down costs. And sometimes, I mean, if they look at their budget and they have to even let people go home, why not? They will do it just to be able to stay afloat. What should businesses do to be able to mitigate the effect of the current inflation that we see on them? Before I move to Dr. President Tumisi.
I think what businesses have to do is to strategize to manage costs effectively. And in an attempt to manage costs effectively, some of them will cut down costs, and that will lead to labor layoffs. Some will have to cut down, they look at the portfolio of business they are doing, and they look at each of them very well and to see which of them will not stand the test of the time in which you are, and then they shelve them or if they look at the portfolio of businesses, they realize that they can cannibalize, then they can continue to operate. So these are the different types of strategies that businesses can do. But there is a limit to what businesses can do in terms of cost cutting, in terms of cost management. And if they manage it to a certain level, if care is not taken, it means that they are going out of business.
All right. Thank you very much, Prof. Let me come to you, Dr. Chumesi. I want to take you to the international and regional context, because I heard you talk about, imports, because the economy seems to be one that is greatly import dependent. And based on that, we are not able to deal with the inflationary pressures that comes on us. From where you sit, if you compare Ghana's inflation rate with its neighbors, or if you look at the global benchmarks, what are the external factors such as the global supply? You mentioned the global supply chain and its influence on inflation. How is this affecting the current inflation that we see? If we say agriculture, we're not producing enough, which means that then we're not exporting. But what is the level of inflation? Because you remember I mentioned Northeast, 11 out of the 16 regions, and Northeast, the poorest region according to Statistical Service, has an inflation that is above 60%. How is that happening? Why do we have to say something that is happening? We should look at global trends, and then we should accept the fact that if we have high inflation, it's because inflation is high almost everywhere.
Thank you, Norvan. I wouldn't say that we should just say that because inflation is high everywhere, we shouldn't be bothered about it, because high is relative. And when we talk about high inflation in the developed world, some of them are crying over inflation rates of 3-4%. Of 40 plus. So essentially, the problem is a tough one, and it is gradually becoming endemic in the country, because we have struggled. The highest we recorded was in December 2022, was 54%, and Ghana's inflation rate is among the highest within the sub-region, and even globally, it is quite high. And for me, the challenge has been that, yes, how do we get a hang over the current situation? And it is all because of the non-performance of the agricultural sector, which is not able to feed industries in terms of value addition, or even basic produce to feed the ordinary Ghanaian, is a problem. And the reason why this is a difficult one also is that when you look at the recent World Bank report that was launched, you see that importation of fertilizer is a big deal in Ghana. And the fact that fertilizer prices have gone up also feeds into the cost of produce, the agricultural produce on the Ghanaian markets. And so you ask yourself, as a country, after how many years, why can't we find alternatives to produce fertilizer domestically to support the agricultural sector, so that we are not that import dependent? Because when you look at it, you see that even within the agricultural sector, it is also highly import dependent, to the extent that the fertilizer that is used to support the sector is imported. And so for me, I think that as a country, we need to be more serious. We need to work at improving the productivity within the agricultural sector, and try as much as possible to reduce the level of import dependence. Import dependence does not come in necessarily because of finished products. Import dependence that come in the form of equipment, in the form of fertilizer, in the form of anything that supports the sector. I think that we've come a long way, and we should be able to substitute away from all these to be able to be quite resilient in the sense that when it comes to food, because when you look at tomatoes, onions, and other things, we are importing them from the sub-region. The recent unrest in Niger is significantly influencing the cost of onions on the Ghanaian market, and this will clearly feed into inflation going forward. And it is all because, I mean, we are importing these things and we haven't found sufficiency in food production, and that is a problem. In addition to the fact that we are not in isolation, and because of that, global happenings also have a toll, especially given that we have a lot of investments, foreign investments in our economy. Any slight thing, when interest rates abroad go up, you find that people would want to move their capital and their resources, and that puts a lot of pressure on the domestic currency and all. So at the end of the day, the issue really is for us to get back to basic and look at our food production and the whole value addition, in addition to cost of energy. Those are also issues because they also feed into the inflation rate, and the fact that even the cost of fuel, the computation, we also use the inflation rate in the computation. So it's more like a cycle that one needs to be very strategic in trying to break that cycle to reduce the inflation rate to the minimum level.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to ask, I have two questions that I'm going to ask. The first one, and I want all of you, our panelists, to try and give us answers, what your thoughts are on this, because I want to look at the livelihood, how inflation is affecting the livelihood of people considering government policies, and then also the high inflation as it is. Now, let's look at these policies. Gold for oil, one district, one factory, one village, one dam, planting for food and jobs, and then also the central bank, buying the gold that we have, especially the small-scale miners. These are all policies that were put in place geared towards to help us to stem the tides when it comes to inflation, right? Because one district, one factory, produce more in this country and let's export. Take advantage of the after. One village, one dam. Let's have dams that we could produce all year round so that the dry season, there'll still be water for the farmers, especially up north, to be able to use it. Planting for food and jobs. So let's get the youth and let's get a lot of people to get into agriculture. So we talk about agriculture, but then these policies were put there. Gold for oil. Let's let people carry cash to go and buy this crude and import into this country. If we can give them the gold we are producing, then take the gold, give us the oil. Money don't go out, but we're able to, make these funds that we are supposed to. My question to you, my guest, in the light of this, what have been the impact of these policies from where you sit on the economy, especially on inflation? Has these policies failed, or are they still in the process of being realized, or what is actually going on? Let me start with you, Dr. President Chumesi, in 2 minutes. I'll give each of you 2 minutes because I want to be able to bring in our listeners as well, because today, as I said, by 8:15, we should be off here. So at some point, what you can do for me is that if you are listening to us and you will have a question or you will have a contribution, what you do is to send us a request. We make you a speaker. And then after my guest has finished answering these questions of mine, we would have you also ask your questions or contribute to the discussion. Yes, so Dr. Chumesi, if you can help us, these policies that are, what do you think? Have they failed? Are they working? Will they work?
Thank you, Norvan. Essentially, one village, one dam. this policy had worked, then probably we will not be dealing with challenges of the agricultural sector at this point, because that was trying to bring irrigation to the doorsteps of districts and villages, and that was supposed to support massively the agricultural sector. One, planting for food and jobs, essentially is also that, and so the fact that our agriculture is still highly very rain fed is a problem, and we have not been able to tackle that effectively. And given that we are dealing with high levels of inflation, with the principal culprits being food, is an indicator that we have not done well as a country in these policies, for whatever reason maybe. One district, one factory was more of like an import substitution strategy to sort of reduce our level of dependence on imports. And so the numbers tell us that indeed these policies at best have had very minimal impact, to the extent that the inflation rate is at where it is, where currently I think we are dealing with about 43% as of July 2023.
Okay, so I think the same question goes to you, Professor Chasaka.
Yeah, thank you. I think Dr. Chimesi Bafo has already, answered the question. What we are observing is a clear indication that these policies are not working, or they have failed, or they are not working at their optimum level. They are good policies, well intended, especially the planting for food and jobs and the one district, one factory. But I think, the planting for food and jobs clearly is not working. And maybe the new Minister of Agriculture has to look at it again and address the challenges and get it to work. Because the price of food is so astronomical. Everywhere you go, you can buy the plantain. Throughout my life in Ghana, I've not asked for a bunch of plantain, and they told me it's 100 Ghana cedi. I never thought that such a thing would happen in this country. Okay, when a bunch of plantain is being quoted at 100 cedis, when you have to buy one coffee brokeman one for 5 cedi. So this planting for food and jobs is not really working. And I think it's about time we moved our eye a little bit from the micro, small agro farms. Because this planting for food and jobs was trying to help the small 1 acre, 2 acre plots. We need large scale farming now, mechanized large scale farming. So if government can assemble some large tracts of land, or look at the private sector, those that are involved in large tracts of land, farming, mechanized, and see how government can support them. You see, the Agriculture Development Bank is not working, and there's no bank that's really giving credit to farmers. So the farmers have to compete. Even if you have a large scale farmer, has to borrow at 30 to 40%, loan credit from any of the commercial banks. They can't be competitive. They cannot be productive. They can't compete from the subsidized agriculture products that are coming from the European Union. You know that the European Union and most other American, the government subsidized farming. Farmers are they are the richest, some of the richest people in Europe. So every cow you see, or every poultry farm, is subsidized by the taxpayer. So if they are subsidized there, and we are not subsidized them, they have to buy, input at high cost, imported input, no support. They have to take credit for 1 year, and then at 40%, 35%. They cannot compete. So I think we need to look at large-scale farming, mechanized farming. Either the government itself has to enter into that. There's nothing wrong to do that, or to support the private sector and give them the land, registered property right, everything, and access to cheap credit and long-term credit. That has not been done, and the small-scale farming is not really helping us. The one district, one factory is good, but again, evidence has shown that it's not really one district, one factory that deals with our import problem. That is good for maybe for employment, but to deal with our import problem, we actually need large-scale, manufacturing businesses, not the small one that we are setting up in the one there's one factory. And there's evidence that when factories are agglomerated, like we have, they are put together like the special zone, in an economic enclave where they have access to cheap utilities and science and skilled labor and government support. They are able to produce more at large scale to take advantage of economies of scale, employ more, and also to export. And I think that's what we need to look at. So the one factory could be done alongside large scale enclave agglomerated special economic zones. I don't know why the Ghana Free Zone board is not really working. The last time I checked, there are just about 185 firms in the enclaves in Tema, Takrade, and I think Kumasi. By now, we need over 1,000 firms that are there and they're producing for the domestic market and also for export. That's what can help us reduce our import dependence.
Very well. Thank you very much. I will have Professor Gachi also tell us what he thinks. And then I think I've seen some tweets. Okay, Louise Hardy, I've seen one of your questions, one district, one factor. I think I've actually asked that question. Your second question, I'll have you ask it yourself. But let Professor Gachi finish what he also think about the same question. These government policies and how, whether it has worked or not, because they are all put there to help stem the tides of inflation. Prof, what's your thought on it? Is it working or is not working?
Well, I think I will just go straight forward. We are just suffering from policy failures. Policies that the government has put in place, they are just a failure. Not that the policies are not good, but the implementation, the commitment that is needed is not put in place. The reviews that has to be done to make the policies effective are not done, especially when you mention the word review. It seems the government is allergic to the word review. So we cannot review our policy to see how impactful they are to the economy. So that is what we need to do. No matter the emphasis on the global development of inflation, it cannot take away the fact that we have left agriculture for a very long time before Russia-Ukraine war. It is necessary to indicate that fuel cost was actually influenced by the war, but I don't see why we should be emphasizing on agriculture. That is one of our problems. I think we can go to Zimbabwe and see what they have done within this short period of time in terms of imparting on food sufficiency and in terms of imparting on prices. So that is what we should be doing here. Our policy makers will have to stand up and ensure that when they do make policies, they have to review the policies to make sure the impact that they expect the policy to make are making. And if they are not making, they take alternative action. And the next thing that I want to emphasize on is that we get to a time that we need to coordinate effectively. We're talking about policy, fiscal policy managers have gone to sleep. But it is not necessarily fiscal policy and monetary policy. Of course, monetary policy management is not mechanistic like we are seeing in the Bank of Ghana. But there is another aspect that we need to emphasize. That is the coordination. How do we position our agriculture policy to impact on food sufficiency and impact on importation? So those are the things that we need to aggressively approach now. And when that is done, then those things can be feeding into one another and we can have a broad-based impact in the country. But as it is now, agriculture is standing somewhere. Fiscal authorities are doing their own thing and the monetary authorities are doing their own thing. I believe there is a need for policy to talk to each other to make a broad-based impact.
Very well. Thank you. Thank you very much. Louis Hadi, can you unmute yourself and then come in with your question? So, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to ask a question yourself or make a contribution, send us a request. We'll accept it and allow you to ask your question. Let us all try to do this in a matter of 2 minutes because we are hard pressed behind time.
All right. Norvan, thanks so much for the opportunity, and thanks a lot to all our speakers. I think they've dealt with largely all the issues and very satisfactorily. I actually want to talk a bit about the livelihood side of things, and I would say that from observations, I don't think government has been very responsive to the issues at stake. You see, on one hand, we are looking at fiscal policy, we are looking at taxes going up, we are looking at introduction of new taxes since COVID. We've seen all this, which are together with inflation, raising cost of living, stretching things out of reach, especially for the poor. And then we know that when you have difficulties or shortfalls in consumptions, in order to maintain a certain minimum level of consumption, you may want to borrow against future income. And the central bank also keeps increasing the rate of interest. So the livelihood side of things, you realize that citizens are being squeezed. So on the right side, you are having prices out of hand. On the left side, monetary side, things are getting out of hand. So I think someone actually has to answer questions, because the rate at which it's going, inflation keeps going up, especially in the poor, in the very poor areas of Ghana, and all this, we might be experiencing other consequences, which might not be intended. And government has to be responsive. And I think largely that's what I want to say.
All right, thank you very much for that. Let's go and read some of the questions that we have. Boss J says it is now 220 licensed companies who are operating in the free zones area. Thank you very much, Boss J, for that. We will verify that as well as we go on. But there's a question for you, Professor Aka. This one is coming from Kwasi Jokoto. He writes, Prof, you seem to downplay the impact of DOG's money printing that has serious influence on inflation. If it is so, why would the World Bank force the BOG to sign an MOU with the Finance Ministry to stop the monetary inflation? Professor Aka, this one is directed at you, please.
Thank you very much. I'm not downplaying the fact that it's economic theory. The economic theory, or the quantity of money, says that MV is equal to PT. Okay, if you accept that theory to be true, and this is a debatable field in economics, that anytime money supply goes up, then the prices of goods must go up. And we are saying that in economic theory now, we say that that is conditional. Okay, so in Ghana, and I want you to check the data, in Ghana, the causes of inflation in Ghana is operating under low capacity utilization. In Europe, when a country is already on the frontier, when a country is already operating at full capacity, full employment, then anytime money supply goes or there's monetary financing, it leads to overheating. When a country like Africa or a country like Ghana is operating with huge youth unemployment, 30% of youth are unemployed, resource underutilization, almost any factory, they're operating at less than 90, 80, 70% of their capacity. It means that there's a lot of resources that are idle. Human resources, material resources are idle. In such economies, monetary financing or the printing of money is not necessarily directly one-to-one leading to inflation, even though it could contribute. So if you draw the figures and you check a Bank of Ghana's data, it is not the main culprit. And actually, if you look at the Bank of Ghana report, you will see. But, we have all accepted that as when they print money, it leads to inflation. It's not always so. And it's not every economy. It's context dependent. Now, the issue about the IMF, that is their idea. The idea is to make sure that central banks are independent and they are not controlled by the Ministry of Finance to print money to support the government. They want the government to raise tax revenue to finance their development. So anytime there's a problem and IMF comes in, one of the things they will do is to try to stop the central bank from printing money. That is it. But look at economic history. Take the US, take Germany, take Japan, take almost even the East Asian countries. You will not find one country which developed without the central bank playing a role in financing development. Our problem here is that when the central bank prints money, sometimes we don't know where it ends. It may go on to finance. In the US, when the central bank supported government, it was a special purpose vehicle. It went into capital stock, it went into infrastructure, it went into creating jobs, and that did not lead to inflation. That's how they all developed. So I am not against central bank financing government budget, for example, as long as it's not going into consumption and it's going into fixing the roads between Accra and Tema, the Tema motorway, fixing the railway, and fixing all the infrastructure challenges we have. It shouldn't lead to inflation necessarily, because actually it's going to deal with the supply bottlenecks. If we agree that food is what is causing our inflation, and if we can arrange and devise a system where money from the central bank can be sent into agro processing, into food production, it is rather going to reduce inflation instead of causing inflation, because it's going to bring food in abundance. And if there's food in abundance, then why would central bank financing cause inflation? So it depends on how much is printed and what is it used for. We should not just conclude that any central bank financing necessarily leads to one-to-one inflation. There's no evidence about that. I've not seen a single evidence in Ghana that shows that.
Thank you very much, Prof. Abdul Karim Mohammed writes, at the end of the day, the consumer bears the brunt of the hyperinflation, but with salaries and incomes not growing in a commensurate manner, what should the ordinary Ghanaian do? Very good question, Abdul Karim. I may want to take the question again, and I'm throwing this question at you, Professor Gachi. And then I'll still have Dr. President Chumisi also to bring his thoughts on it. He says that at the end of the day, the consumer bears the brunt of the hyperinflation that we see. But with salaries and incomes not growing in a commensurate manner, what should the ordinary Ghanaian do as we see inflation continue to surge high?
Is that for me?
Yes, please.
Well, it's a difficult question. When you allow economic management outcomes to actually create problem for masses of individuals, it will get to a point they cannot take it, and I believe they either keep quiet and suffer, or they become agitated and will be expressing it in various forms. And I believe we have seen expression of that in many ways already from the public about the suffering going on. What we can do is to alert government to live up to its responsibility. What is being done to people in other countries before money was released into the system for which inflation was recorded. These are not the same thing that the government is doing. All that government is focusing on is to make sure that the balance sheet look good. It's not concerned about the citizens. It's not concerned about the suffering. It's not concerned about the factories and the businesses closing down. And it's not concerned so much about the erosion of business income, erosion of personal income, and then the inability of people to work and something for a living. So I think that government need to change course and show empathy to the people.
Thank you very much, Prof. Still staying on some of the measures that can be used to mitigate the inflation as we see. Let me come to you, Dr. Priscilla Chumesi, and I think we'll be wrapping up shortly on our space. I mean, if you look at the inflation which is shaping livelihoods as we see today, now, which social policies do you think must be activated to save the lives of the very poor? And I want you to bear in mind the fact that according to our statistics, over 800,000 Ghanaians have fallen into the poverty line. Statistics from 2022 from Ghana Statistical Service and what the World Bank is showing us, over 800,000 Ghanaians are below or have fallen into the poverty line. What should be the social policies that should be put in place to deal with bringing these people back from where we find ourselves?
Thank you, Norvan. But unfortunately, I believe that this is not the time for government to roll out a lot of social policies, because the fact is that we need to bring inflation down. And the language we have all spoken is that it is a coordinated effort between monetary policy and fiscal policy. Fiscal policy can help by cutting down on expenditure. But when you look at government budgets and the program Ghana is currently on, you find that a lot of the social interventions that exist have been maintained. And so that is good to support the poor, at best to maintain people's standards of living and not to further worsen the plight of the struggling Ghanaian. So government unfortunately cannot roll out any additional programs to cushion the individual. But at the individual level, I would say that yes, as we discussed, inflation is 43%, but there are strategies that individuals can adopt to cushion themselves, because this is an aggregate indicator. When you look at the data, some commodities have higher inflation compared to others. So the strategy would be to sort of look for alternative goods and services that are not experiencing higher inflation. Individuals ought to probably monitor their budgets to keep a constant eye on what is happening, so that the income is not wasted away. We need to watch, individuals also need to watch returns on their investments. This one too, domestic debt exchange has also robbed a lot of people of their investment. So it's a difficult terrain, really, as we speak. But overall, individuals ought to be vigilant, cut down on wasteful expenditure. Probably this is not the time that you have to go for a loan with variable interest rates, for example. Other things you can do at the domestic level, probably you can check your consumption, energy consumption, and cut back here and there, so that people can maintain standards of living at best. But I think that is what it is. On the part of government, I also think that one factor that has not really come out is that we need to also indicate that the fact that monies are changing hands does not necessarily mean that economic activity is boosted. And corruption and overvaluation of government projects is also one of the ways which causes inflation, because essentially money moves, but you don't see that productivity is occurring. And people have money that they get to spend out there, and it does not commensurate with productive activity. And that also contributes to fuel the price hikes that we experience. But essentially, to control inflation, the supply side challenges ought to be addressed. And those are the problems that entrepreneurs and firms face in this country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to bring in Professor Lord Mensah to give us what he also thinks. And then because I want my panelists to just take a breather. After him, I would let my panelists tell me the one thing that they think, or maybe two. One looking at the economy side, and one either business or the citizen should do. I know that Professor Dr. Chumesi, you've mentioned a few of them, but as we walk away, we all do know, and we've learned from tonight, that our inflation is one that is self-inflated. The economy which was growing, because when I was in primary school, all that we read in our books was the Ghanaian economy is an agriculture-based economy. We heard about the Agricultural Development Bank, the bank that gave loans to farmers. So that was the notion we're growing with. But we've seen the economy move from the agriculture side to become a service-based economy. Should that be the case? Or should we have agri and service go hand in hand? How do we deal with this to ensure that, because food, if it's not there, somebody will say, if you take control of food, you can control human beings. If you take control of food, you can control human beings. That is what some people have said. Professor Lord Mensah, let me bring you in for 2 minutes, and then I'll go to my guests to just give me their closing remarks, and then we'll bring the space to an end. We've gone beyond the time that we wanted to go.
Okay, thank you very much, Norvan. I think my panelists out there have, put sum it up all. I mean, we have come to understand that, inflation drivers are multifaceted, and as a result of that, we may have to look at, the monetary side of our economic management, and at the same time, the fiscal aspect of our economic management. But then drilling down, we need to appreciate that all those countries that we can easily compare Ghana with, which they are recording, inflation below 20%, thereabouts. They prioritize their policies. Prioritization of policies is very, very important. When you roll out, planting for food and jobs, and you leave it open, you send out the money, you read a budget with huge funds allocated for the policy, but then you end up not getting anything out on the market. But then if you make it a point that this policy is going to produce maize, targeted, and we know very well that for a typical household in Ghana, a child of 6 months will start eating maize. Cornflakes are made from maize. Cerelac and other things are all made from maize. And even when we're growing up, we saw, our kid brothers eating, banku at the 6 month level upwards. So from where I sit, it has to do with prioritization. And that is why sometimes I made mention, and I indicated that lots of the budget allocations for the planting for food and jobs ended up at the doorstep of the hotels in the name of building capacity. Capacity building took chunk of the money without going to the field. So from where I sit, I think, we can go on with our expenditure lines, which is the fiscal side and all those. But, if we really want to make impact or benefit from some of these policies in a way to control inflation, we may have to prioritize, some of these spendings. And then also with the issue of central bank, supply of funds to the government causing inflation. Yes, central banks always print money, but the channels through which they get the money into the system is very, very important. There is a horizon that the fiscal aspect works up to, and it's tied to political, regimes. And we can say that it's purely short term. That's 4 years maximum. So if you print money for the executive or you print money for the government is looking at policies that.
Hello? I think we've lost Professor Lord Mensah. So let me quickly now come to my guest. This is what I'm going to do, because there are 3 thematic areas, which is how inflation is affecting the citizen, how inflation is affecting businesses, and how the economy is also being affected. So let me have Professor Aka come in here, and you try and address in 1 minute for me how you think, Professor Aka, how you think we can stem the tide when it comes to inflation in the area of the citizen. Yes.
Yeah, Roland, are you done with me? Sorry. Are you
Yeah.
done with me, please?
Yeah, because you went off. Well, if you in 1 minute you can just end for me, and then I'll just
Yeah,
wrap
so
up with
what
my
I'm
guest.
saying is that the central bank can print money, but the channels through which they get the money into the economy is very, very important. So the channeling through the fiscal, doors, clearly, will be purely short term because that is managed by the politician. That is why, with engagement with the IMF, they insist that the central bank is not supposed to finance, the government. And the insistence is important because the central bank merely, has to keep the economy going, devoid of what political regime, and so that is why necessarily the central bank's printing of money to the government needs to be controlled.
All right, thank you very much. So, Professor Aka, if you can unmute yourself, finally, how do you think the businessman can handle inflation at this time to be able to stay afloat?
Thank you. I think this question was attempted by Professor Gatsi. It's a difficult question. Because honestly, if you look at the data from Ghana Statistical Service, I don't know what the household or the consumer do. The price of almost every item has gone up. On the food side, there's no food item that has not gone up about 40%. So it's actually the food every if you can change your diet, you can move from bread to whatever kose or whatever it, or you will still have to pay about 40% more than you paid last in the over the last 1 year. And when you come to the non-food section, in fact, you need to pay attention to the producer price index as well. Because so far we have been talking about consumer price index. When you look at the producer price index, which measures, the prices that producers pay for producing goods and services, it's also about almost 36%. Okay, over the last 1 year, and the single most important item there is electricity and gas, 69.6%, which means that producers, manufacturing companies are paying 69.7% more than they paid a year ago to take electricity and gas to produce goods and services. So, what do they have to do? Borrowing costs has gone up, interest rates have gone up, raw materials have gone up, exchange rate has depreciated. So, if you're a businessman or you are I spoke to one businessman about 2 weeks ago. We met at the Washing Bay. He said they're only considering to lay off workers. They just have to cut costs. And the easiest cost they have to cut is to lay off workers. That's basically what's happening. So if you're on the household side, you just have to starve or reduce the amount of food you eat. Or I don't know what you're going to do. I think we should rather look at on the policy side. What should government do? And I think that it is in this era that we need the government to show more compassion. And I'm therefore surprised that in the midst of rising cost of living, this is also the time that government is imposing more and new taxes. This is the time that they are also taking away subsidies and allowing basic things like electricity and gas and fuel to go into the roof. I think that is something that government needs to look at. In some other countries, they supported, they subsidized, or they even gave cash out, or they introduced price control, strategic selected price control on essential commodities that the poor consume. And here, fuel is one of them. Gas, LPG, is one of them. I think government should need to look at constraining the rises in the price of fuel, transportation, and LPG for consumption.
Thank you very much, Professor Charles Aka and Professor John Gaji. What's your thought? If you are looking at the economic side, what will you add to what Professor Aka has said? finally?
I think nobody is saying that central bank cannot support government activities. An economic management that is devoid of respect for the law is bound to fail or to have serious problem for citizens. So that is why I believe a minimum threshold of what the central bank can do to support government activities should be set, and it was set. And I also think the central bank is supposed to primarily focus on price stability and economic development. How that economic development agenda is pursued must be well defined. Instead of doling out money to dead SOEs who are just consumers of state money, will not turn money to do anything significant and declare those things as losses. The central bank should look into the economy to see whether it will target agriculture, it will target some aspect of the economy that will be meaningful, be impactful to the economy, instead of giving out money to various groups of people, institutions, which we know do not have the capacity to utilize the money well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Priscilla. You ended for us tonight. I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, government policies, mitigation measures that we need at this time to be able to stay afloat.
Thank you, Norvan. I think that in all this, we all agree that cost of food is a problem. And so there is the need for us to relook at our agricultural sector and our whole industrialization, industrial policy. And so for me, I mean, whenever we talk about food production and food prices, the pivotal point has always been Operation Feed Yourself. But I think that at this point, we need to get beyond agriculture in silos, individual smallholder farmers. We need to tackle agriculture on a large scale, commercial level, increase productivity in the sector, boost value addition along the agricultural value chain. And in doing that, we will be able to feed ourselves at a much cheaper rate, create jobs, and also extend the prosperity into other sectors and bring the rising cost of living down through a decrease in inflation. So that will be my final take on it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to you. That is Professor Charles Aka, and then Professor John Gachi, and also to you, Dr. Priscilla Chumesi. Want to thank you very much for making time and being part of tonight's space. It's been one that we've learned a lot. We have picked what are the challenges, what are the problems, how we can deal with it at this time. Now we know that the biggest problem that we face as a country has to do with our inability to handle our agriculture. And as I did say, anyone in control of food can control the people around him. And it means that we've come to the point where if government really wants to stem the tides on inflation, it must go back to the drawing board and take a look at its policies. One district, one factory, one village, one dam, planting for food and jobs. It's one way we can stem the tide when it comes to inflation in this country. My name is Norvan Reports, and a big thank you to our panel. Again, I'm Dr. Priscilla Chumesi, is a senior lecturer at the Department of Economics at the University of Ghana. And Professor John Gachi is the Dean of the Business School at the University of Cape Coast. And then Professor Charles Aka is a senior research fellow at ISED, Institute of Statistical and Economic Research at the University of Ghana. And we want to thank you so much. We hope that when we call upon you again, you'll make time for us. You know that this space, ladies and gentlemen, is held bi-weekly. So we'll